Hi, welcome to our Week 2, Lecture 1 on metamorphic rocks. So far we've talked about the classification of igneous rocks and sedimentary rocks and started to learn about how to name these rocks and identify important features. Today I'll talk a bit about metamorphic rocks in general and how they form. And we'll get into the details of foliations a bit later, but I'll touch on that concept today. Metamorphic rocks are produced by pressure-temperature transformation of an earlier rock. Minerals are chemicals, and minerals or combinations of minerals are stable or metastable under specific conditions of pressure and temperature. So given additional heat, pressure, and time, minerals will change. And this process is effectively metamorphism. The process of metamorphism is also associated with the formation of planar and linear fabric, or foliations and lineations, in these rocks. And we'll get into quite a bit of detail about these fabrics in future lectures. But first, why do we care about metamorphic rocks? First, we study metamorphic rocks to understand the evolution of an area, how deep the rocks went when they metamorphosed, what was the order of events, etc. This is under the realm of trying to understand tectonics. Second, we study metamorphic rocks to try to understand their protolith, or what they started out as, and therefore piece together their paleo environment, and also continue to develop our understanding of tectonic history. Third, we study metamorphic processes to try to understand what we might encounter in the field, resolve quandaries, and develop geological models, and eventually maps. Fourth and last, we study metamorphic structures to try to understand the geometry of folded and otherwise deformed rocks, and this becomes very important for structural geology as well as engineering. There are two major types of metamorphism, contact and regional metamorphism. There is also an occasional third type of shock metamorphism, which happens under fairly unique circumstances. Contact metamorphism is local heating that causes mineralogical transformation in a rock, or cooking, as we talked a bit about last week. The heat source is not in equilibrium with the geotherm of the crust. It has short-range effects and is always near an intrusion. Regional metamorphism is directly linked to the geotherm, and the regional geotherm causes mineralogical transformation in the rock. The heat source itself is the geotherm, although there are different geotherms in different areas within a crust. Shock metamorphism can be caused by meteorite impact or nuclear bombs. Contact metamorphism requires local heating that causes the mineralogical transformation in a rock. The short-range context of this is on the order of centimeters to a few hundreds of meters. This range is strongly related to how big the source of heat is. For example, the source of heat of a dike would be significantly smaller than the source of a pluton. Contact metamorphism needs a heat source that is abnormally hot for the environment it's in, so it generally occurs in shallow or low pressure or low stress conditions. This often results in a fine-grained metamorphic rock called a hornfels. And here's an example shown on the slide. It looks kind of like a basalt, but in a field context, it's very brittle. Here's a fantastic example of contact metamorphism at a hundreds of meters or mountain range scale. You can see limestone is bounding an intrusion. The contact boundary between the intrusion and the limestone, you can see a light-colored halo of marble on either side of the intrusion. And limestone is the protolith of marble. As we discussed a bit last week, contact metamorphism is much less obvious, if it's observable at all, when we're looking at the scale of a dike that cuts an igneous rock. So on the left, there's an example of a felsic dike, and you really can't tell much of any contact metamorphism happening. And the only indication of the contact metamorphism on the right is the chilled margin surrounding the dike. The Pluton intrusion scale of contact metamorphism shows much better defined zones that have different metamorphic minerals associated with them. So going from the central Pluton, which would be the highest temperature, looking at the example on the top, you have the sillimanite hornfels, moving outward a biotite and andalusite hornfels, and further outside of that is chlorite hornfels. And that would be in the unit of a shale. We'll talk a bit more about chlorite, biotite, andalusite, and sillimanite a bit later, as they are metamorphic minerals that have specific pressure temperature zones of formation. Looking again at the example on the top right, near the granite Pluton, the limestone is metamorphosed to marble, and the quartz sandstone is metamorphosed to quartzite. There are some other examples of zoning shown on the bottom two images of the slide. Regional metamorphism is driven by the regional geotherm that causes mineralogical transformation in a rock. And as I mentioned before, the heat source is the geotherm, but there's a variety of different geotherms depending on what region within a crust you're in. Looking at the example shown here, in a continental crust, you have effectively going downward from the top of the mountain toward the mantle. You have increasing temperature and consequently an increasing grade of metamorphism until melting starts close to the mantle. There are 3 different points from this diagram that are highlighted on the pressure temperature graph on the right. We'll be seeing a lot of varieties of the pressure temperature diagram. Looking at the example at the top, which is closest to ground surface, the rocks there will be in a region of low-grade metamorphism. As you go deeper to the second example, it's entering a region of high-grade metamorphism, so the metamorphic minerals that develop between these two zones will be different. The third example on the bottom is at a high enough pressure and temperature where melting begins and the solid rock is lost effectively. As we pile up rocks through crustal movement, the rocks at the bottom heat up, so the roots of the mountain belt will be hot. As the mountains erode, eventually we'll see the mid to lower crust exposed at the ground surface, which is like what we see here in Kingston today in the Frontenac Arch. As the erosion process happens, the rocks that were originally at the foot or in the roots of the mountain belt will cool off, but the effects of metamorphism will be preserved. You can see in the diagram on the right here how the geothermal gradient, shown by the dashed red lines, will change depending on where you are in the context of a subduction zone. Here's an example of a mountain belt that's formed through a subduction zone or a collisional origin mountain building event. The cross-section at the top is what all of the rocks that would form during that event. On the bottom, it's showing it once the erosion has taken place, which may take a while. A lot of the evidence of the rocks that were higher up in the section are gone, and now we're left with looking at the mid-crustal rocks, or the roots of the mountain belt. Depending on the geothermal gradient, or the pressure-temperature gradient, it gets hotter with depth at a certain rate, again, depending where you are within a plate. Take, for example, the United States. We have the Sierra Nevada of the Craton, and we have the Basin and Range province. These 3 regions have different pressure-temperature gradients, and therefore rocks of different metamorphic grades, and therefore different metamorphic mineral composition are found in each of these regions. As you can imagine, the resulting changes through regional metamorphism are very complex, so we simplify. First, by what happens to, quote, standard rock types. Second, by picking rocks that show metamorphism well. And 3, by simplifying to generic cases. So what happens as you bury the following surface rock types: basalt, sandstone, limestone, and shale? I'll go through each of these examples in the next few slides. First, looking at the metamorphism of basalt. We start with basalt at the top left in this image. As we increase metamorphism, we go through a greenstone to a schist, which more specifically would be a chlorite schist. There is not too much foliation that would be distinctive compared to shale-derived metamorphic rocks. In the greenstone rock, going from basalt to greenstone with metamorphism, the primary igneous minerals olivine and pyroxene will change to chlorite. And chlorite gives the greenstone that distinct green color. Looking at metamorphism of sandstone, we go from sandstone to quartzite. On the right of this slide, there are two examples of what these rocks look like in thin section. You can see the sandstone has very rounded grains with spaces in between them, whereas the quartzite has very different shaped quartz grains that are quite interlocked by comparison. Their contact boundaries can also be quite angular. Here's another diagram showing the metamorphic changes between sandstone and quartzite. This sketch is showing the rounded grains again of the sandstone, and you can see the matrix and pore space in between. Now, during metamorphism, the quartz will recrystallize and you'll end up with different grain shapes and properties. So at the microscopic scale, we have a much more mosaic texture, and this diagram further illustrates the interlocking of those quartz grains and really the pore space. What once was between the grains and the sandstone has now disappeared. Consequently, quartzite tends to be a much stronger rock compared to a sandstone. What happens when you metamorphose limestone? Limestone, being calcium carbonate, will become a marble. There are examples of these rocks in thin section shown on the right. The limestone on the top, very fine-grained with fossils that are present. On the bottom, thin section showing the marble, however, you can see much larger grains of calcite that have had time to grow during metamorphism, and you can see the fossils have effectively disappeared. Contamination in these rocks is quite common, so you won't necessarily have a pure sandstone or a pure limestone to start with. So here are some examples of when you have a dolostone with some quartz and clay mixed in, and you metamorphose to dominantly a marble. There are still some impurities that are present as a result of the metamorphism. For example, the clay would metamorphose to the mica grains we can now see in this marble. On the bottom, an impure sandstone with some dolomite present will metamorphose into a quartzite. Again, it'll be a quartzite, however, there will likely be some grains of marble present because of the dolomite that was part of the original sedimentary rock. Here's a zoomed-in image of the marble that has contamination from what was clay and quartz. So again, you can see the flakes of mica embedded in the rock, and there is still quartz present in this rock as well. The sandstone with some dolomite results in a quartzite that has traces of potassium feldspar and diopside. Let's have a look at the broad classification of metamorphic rocks for a second. The foliated versus the non-foliated rocks. Foliated metamorphic rocks include slate, schist, and gneiss, and non-foliated metamorphic rocks include quartzites and marbles. But we see things that look like foliations in the field sometimes when we come across outcrops of marble and quartzite. And these two examples are from the Kingston area that you'll see in this course or in GEOEL300. So what gives? Why do you think that these, quote, things that look like foliations might exist in these metamorphic rocks? Please add your ideas to the lecture's Q&A Google Doc. Next up, metamorphism of shale. With increasing metamorphism, i.e. increasing pressure and temperature, we go from a shale to a slate, then phyllite, schist, and up to gneiss. It's important to remember throughout this metamorphism process, the bulk composition of the rock is not changing. It's just being rearranged for different minerals to grow. Metamorphism of shale does result in foliated rocks. Here's a slide you'll recognize from last week that shows the original rocks that would have randomly oriented and small mineral crystal grains. With metamorphism and directed pressure from a dominant orientation, the rock will effectively squish, the mineral crystal grains will align, and result in the foliation that is preserved in the metamorphic rock. I'll get into the details of foliations later this week in terms of how we look for them in the field and measure them to help us create our geological models and geological maps. Bringing it back to this pressure-temperature diagram, the version of this graph on the left from your chapter reading this week shows the general types of metamorphism for the various zones of pressure and temperature, including contact metamorphism, regional metamorphism from low grade through to intermediate and high grade toward the partial melting zone. And there's also another zone for subduction zone metamorphism, as well as boreal metamorphism, and it all starts with diagenesis of the parent rock near ground surface, i.e. for sedimentary and igneous rocks. Now we can translate this diagram to the one on the right that actually shows zones related to mineralogy that are present in rocks that experienced these pressures and temperatures. For example, you can see in the very low pressure but high temperature zone we have hornfels, which corresponds to the zone of contact metamorphism. And now I hope you can start to see how we can observe rocks in the field, such as a hornfels or a green schist, and piece together the pressure and temperature conditions that were required to form these rocks, bring this back to this other diagram to then make interpretations about where these rocks would have formed in a plate tectonic setting, and ultimately piece together the geological history of these rocks and the area in which they formed. So these zones of different mineral groups are called metamorphic facies. For example, a metabasalt, or a basalt that has been metamorphosed to a green schist grade, will have a set of distinct minerals that we can recognize. So will a metashale, but the metashale and the metabasalt will not have the same metamorphic minerals. So how do we use this? First, you can learn what are the diagnostic minerals for each facies. Second, you can learn to ID those minerals in a rock. And third, you can then assess the metamorphic grade of a rock. And you'll learn to do all of these things during this course. This is a very useful reference chart that lists the characteristic mineralogies of 3 common regional metamorphic facies and 3 precursors of different chemical compositions. So we have the precursor rock types of palitic, i.e. shale-like rock, calcareous, i.e. limestone or carbonate rock, and mafic rocks. On the facies, we have green schist, amphibolite, and granulite facies, and in each of these boxes, you can see what are the minerals that are almost always present and sometimes present in these combinations of precursor rock types and metamorphic grade or facies. So as I've been hinting at, you can now link field geology back to the expected tectonic environment. So if we have yet another version of the pressure temperature diagram shown on the left, we can plot number 1 as a subduction zone that will generate zeolite and blue schist rock groups. Number 2, we can look at what a normal continental or intraplate zone of rocks will generate, zeolite, green schist, and fibolite to granulite. We can look at number 3, volcanic and plutonic arcs. And 4, we can look at contact metamorphism. Here are a few examples of naming metamorphic rocks. This is just to get you started, and we'll do a lot more of this as the course goes on. To name metamorphic rocks, we look at the texture modified by the minerals that are present. This rock, for example, is a schist that contains biotite and muscovite as the dominant minerals. Therefore, we would name this rock a biotite muscovite schist. This is another example of a schist. It contains biotite muscovite with some garnet porphyroblasts that are large crystals within a finer grained ground mass. And we add porphyroblasts to the name of metamorphic rocks. So in this case, this name would be a biotite muscovite garnet schist. Third, we have a gneiss. In a gneiss, we have alternating mafic and felsic layers. To name this rock, we focus on the mineral assemblage in the dark or mafic layers. So in this example, we have biotite and hornblende as the dominant minerals in the mafic layers. So it would be a biotite hornblende gneiss. It's important to note, however, that both layers must be described in your field notes, which will be used to ultimately write a detailed description of the rock that anybody reading your notes would be able to use to identify the rocks themselves. We'll talk more about that in future lectures. Thanks for watching. Please add your comments and questions to the lecture Q&A Google Doc that's posted on OnQ, and read Chapter 7 on metamorphism and metamorphic rocks. Thanks. Bye.